Hi, thank you for coming. If my name is Josephine Jojo, and I am the bilingual education coordinator at Support for Families. If this is your first time here, our agency is based in San Francisco and has been providing support for families with children with disabilities of all ages um, for more than 30 years. In our agency, more than 50% of our sorry, uh, more than 50% of the team are professionals and parents of children with families of children with disabilities or special care needs. In support for families, we provide information, education. Sorry, I have some problem with my screen. Okay, sorry. We provide information, education, support, resources, and referral. We have support groups for parents. We have one-on-one support through our family resource specialist. We have a peer-to-peer parent mentor program, and we offer ongoing workshops and trainings, such as tonight's presentation for caregivers of children with disabilities and the professionals who support them. During the presentation, you will find a link in the chat to evaluate this workshop. This short feedback helped us improve our programming and maintain it free for all participants. Evaluations serve as a tool for funders to measure the impact of our work. So therefore, please take a moment to fill it out before you leave the sessions. And the full presentation will be shared afterwards. So, and also Fabi had mentioned that the recordings will be available in the YouTube channel too. So I will pass to Lee for the start of the presentation. Thank you.
All right. Jojo, thank you so much for that fantastic intro. And I think we're ready to go with the slides. We have a lot to cover tonight. This is part 4 of a 4-part workshop. And so, because we know we have some new faces and this is being recorded to the YouTube channel, we have a plan to we're going to review some of the materials from parts 1 through 3. All of it is available on the Support for Families YouTube channel. You can watch each of the sessions individually. And then we'll get right into part 4, which is the offer of FAPE and tying it together through strong advocacy strategies. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I also just want to say thank you so much to everyone who's here or everyone who's watching this online. This is being recorded on December 13th. There's a lot going on in our schools this time of year, and the fact that everyone is choosing to be here with us when you could be in a gazillion other places, we really appreciate it. Thank you for being with us. A little bit about CASE. We are a small but mighty nonprofit that supports clients in the San Francisco Bay Area. We help students and their families access and navigate special education services. And the advocates of CASE, help students and their families develop individualized education programs, 504 plans. We support and empower students and their families as they learn their rights and responsibilities in special education and beyond. No one is ever turned away from our services for lack of ability to pay. We work on sliding scale. And so you'll have some information a little bit later about how to reach out to us if you're interested in doing a free consultation. So more on that later. Next slide, please. And as Jojo already stated, we work very closely with Support for Families, our local parent training information center, and Family Resource Center, Family Empowerment Center. They do a lot of great workshops. There will be a QR code later in the presentation where you can have access to their calendar for more presentations like this. So next slide, please. And shameless plug, CASE and the Disability Rights California organization have worked together for many, many, many years to put together the Special Education Rights and Responsibilities Manual. This easy to use guide helps families and professionals navigate special education services. So, this is a free resource online. It's written in frequently asked questions style. If you have questions, you're not sure if you need to reach out and attend a training or talk to an advocate, this is, if you go to, we just dropped a link into the chat for those of you who are here today. The way this is organized is by chapters. You can quickly find the chapter you're interested in, and then after that, you click on the question that you want answered, and the answer's there along with the reference to the ed code. It is a wonderful resource. If you haven't checked it out, check it out. It is a great way to answer questions. Next slide, please. Okay, so our agenda for tonight, like I said, we'll review workshops 1 through 3. We'll talk about FAPE in the LRE, free appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. We'll talk about accommodations and services. I don't think we're going to have time to review those services grids, but we will talk about advocacy strategies and leave time for Q&A. So next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to popcorn to Karma for the next slide, and she will talk about some of the basics of the IDEA and our procedural safeguards.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Karma Cook-Panwala, the Director of Advocacy at CASE. Can we move to the next slide, please? So just a review, there are a number of state and federal laws that are so important to know as we navigate this process. The first one is the Individuals with Disabilities and Education Act. That is the federal special education law. It includes the framework of the special education process, and it contains parents' rights. Then there's the California Education Code. This law implements the IDEA at the state level. The next one is the Federal Education Records and Privacy Act, which ensures that all student records for students under the age of 18 are kept confidential by school districts and by other people who have an obligation to keep them confidential. And it also ensures that the records of students in higher education, such as college or vocational training, have access to their records, but that those records are kept confidential as well. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 is a federal civil rights law that prohibits disability discrimination. It applies to any federal agency or any entity, any business or office that receives federal funding. The Americans with Disabilities Act, Title II, applies to all public entities, including public school districts and public colleges and public universities. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires physical accessibility, and it also, more importantly, requires accessibility for every single disability and the accommodations that disabled people need as they move about their lives throughout society. The Lanterman Act controls the regional services and ensures that people with disabilities, developmental disabilities, have access to the regional services and to services that help them live in the community. And it also helps ensure services before the age of 3 and after 18. The McKinney-Vento Act. I believe this is for homeless students. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but this law protects the right of homeless students as they access services at school. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a federal civil rights act and makes sure that there is no discrimination on the basis of race, nationality, or national origin, religion, and language. Next slide, please. So here are some really important concepts about the IDEA. The IDEA is the law that all parents will use most of all when we go through the special education process. Child find, the fact that all schools must find and evaluate students suspected of having disabilities at no cost to parents. FAPE, a free, appropriate public education, which must be made available to all children residing in the state between the ages of 3 and 21, including children with disabilities who have been suspended or expelled from school. And also the least restrictive environment. Children with disabilities should be educated with children who are non-disabled, and special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular education environment occurs only if the nature or the severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. Next slide. So, what are parents' rights in education? First of all parents.
Do I have what?
All parents have the right to participate. The parents have the right to refer their child for special education services, to participate in the development of the IEP, and to be informed of all program options and alternatives, both public and non-public. Parents also have the right to receive prior written notice. Basically, prior written notice is a written response from the school district and in their native language when the school district initiates or refuses a parent's request to change the student's education, identification, assessment, or educational placement in special education. Let's move on to the next slide. Parents also have the right to consent, and in California, the right to refuse to consent and to consent with exception. Parents must provide informed written consent before their child is assessed or provided with any special education services. Parental consent must also be provided before any change in special education services may occur. The district must ensure that parents understand the proceedings of the IEP team meeting, including arranging for an interpreter for parents with deafness or those whose native language is one other than English. Parents may also refuse to consent to an assessment or to the placement of their child in special education. And the parents and the students have the right to be given a non-discriminatory assessment, meaning that they can be assessed for special education. Ooh, could you go back, please? Thank you. I think we are on slide 10. There we go. So children must be assessed for special education using any sort of test batteries that are non-discriminatory and non-biased. And parents have the right to an independent educational assessment. If parents disagree with the results of the assessment that the school district conducts, parents have the right to ask for and obtain an independent educational assessment at public expense, meaning no cost to the family. The parents are entitled to only one independent assessment for each time the public agency conducts an assessment of the student that the parent disagrees with. When a parent requests an IEE at public expense, the school district must, without unnecessary delay, ensure that the IEE is provided at public expense or request a due process hearing if the district believes their assessment was appropriate and disagrees that an independent assessment is necessary. The school district also has the right to establish standards or criteria, including the cost and location for IEEs at public expense. All right, let's go on to the next slide. There are so many timelines that it's important to pay attention to throughout this process. School districts do not have unlimited time to do everything that they need to do. There are timelines that the school district must comply with. For example, if a parent requests that the student be assessed for special education, the school district in California must provide them with an assessment plan no later than 15 days after the request for an assessment. Once the parent signs the assessment plan and returns it to the school district has 60 calendar days to complete the assessment and hold an IEP meeting to discuss the results of that assessment. There is one caveat, and that school weeks of 5 days or longer are not included in the 60-day calendar day timeline. Next slide. There's also a requirement that the IEP team meet at least annually to develop the IEP and all of the appropriate goals, services, and accommodations that the student needs. The IEP team can meet more than one time a year, but they're required to meet at least once a year to develop the IEP. The parents can request an IEP meeting, and if a parent requests an IEP meeting to discuss concerns or because they have questions or they want to change the IEP meeting must be held within 30 calendar days. The IEP meeting to review a student's lack of anticipated process, no statutory timeline there. However, the parent can call an IEP meeting if they feel their student is not making progress on the IEP. There are many other timelines that have to be adhered to. For example, by the time a student is 16, the school district must have a transition plan in place for the student's transition to adulthood. The transition plan will include goals for post-secondary education, job or training, and independent living. And student has to be informed of the transfer of rights by the time they are 17 years old. When a student turns 18, they get to be the decision maker of their own IEP and education process. Students who are conserved may be the exception, but for parents who are concerned about this, that process should start earlier. And finally, notice of a student's graduation from high school with a diploma. Only reasonable prior written notice must be provided. There's no requirement to have an IEP meeting when a student is ready to graduate with a diploma. Next slide. All right, here's another shameless plug for our Special Education Rights and Responsibilities Manual. Please scan the QR code to be taken to this incredibly important resource. All of the information that is in the Special Education Rights and Responsibilities Manual is information that case advocates and parent mentors at Support for Families use on a regular basis to help all of our clients. Next one. All right, we're going to review assessments and needs, and I am popcorning over to Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Karma. Good evening, everyone. My name is Stephanie. I'm an intern with CASE and a student at SF State. I'm also a parent of a child with an IEP. Thank you all for being here with us. So, next slide, please. Thank you so much. Breaking down the IEP process. Needs drive goals and goals drive services because they are interconnected and work together to support the student's educational journey and ensure FAPE, free appropriate public education. The IEP process begins by identifying the unique needs of the child. This involves gathering information from parents, teachers, and specialists to understand the areas where the child requires support. These needs can be academic, social, emotional, or related to specific disabilities. Once the needs are identified, the IEP team sets specific goals for the child. These goals are based on the child's current abilities and aims to address their individual needs. For example, if a child struggles with reading comprehension, a goal might be to improve their reading comprehension skills by a certain percentage within a specified time frame. To help the child achieve their goals, the IEP outlines the services and supports they will receive from the district. This can include specialized instruction, accommodations,
I think Maggie's good because she'll keep her.
modifications, therapies, and related services like speech therapy or occupational therapy. The IEP team works together to determine what services are necessary and appropriate for the child's success. The IEP process is a collaborative effort that involves input from various individuals, including parents, caregivers. That's us. You are important. You are an important member of the team. And with respect to the professionals, you know your child the best. Teachers, specialists, and the child, when appropriate, also contribute to the process. I'll popcorn it to Lee, or if you'd like to add anything else.
Brilliant. That is a, oh, of course, I get a spam call right as I unmute. Isn't that how it works? Anyway, yeah, that was a great overview, Stephanie. And just, I think that what is so different here about this slide is it's not the way that we parents of students with disabilities tend to think. We tend to think about the process starting with where our student is right now, their classroom, their setting, general ed, special day class, whatever that is. And that is not the way that the school site teams think. That's not the way any of our special education administrators think. They think in the process that's laid out here. And so thank you so much, Stephanie, for breaking it down so beautifully. And that's where we at CASE come in very often, is helping families phrase their concerns and understanding the process and how to get to what it is that we're all looking for. So next slide, please. Having said that, and we have a tension here because we only have 2 hours, and we have, between the review, like when we did this in person and we did our in-person workshop, this was a 2-day, 6 hours per day presentation. So we're trying to cram as much of it as we possibly can into 2 hours. The slides will be available after the presentation for anyone who wants it. And we very much, we live a life of accessibility at CASE. Accessibility is critically important. Language, disability, whatever, we need to be accessible. And that is why we take the time to read all the words on the slides so that people who need multimodal ways to access this have access to it. So our interpreters actually have time to interpret everything we're saying. So that is why you might, in the business world, very often the advice that we get is, don't read every word on the screen. But in the accessibility world, it's important to read every word on the screen. So here we are. So getting back to the presentation instead of my monologuing. So Stephanie just laid out the process beautifully. And when you talk about areas of need and trying to identify some of those area of needs, that's why we assess. And our assessments are very often academically driven, or they are cognitively driven. But there's a lot of other areas of need that children experience at school. School is more than just academics. If it were just academics, we would have individualized academic plans instead of individualized education plans. So when you think about the whole child and the whole education, we need to think about executive function, planning and prioritizing, task initiation, time management, organization, emotional regulation and impulse control, flexible thinking, goal setting and self-monitoring, stamina and perseverance through the tough tasks. Self-advocacy, especially as our students get older, well, at all ages, critically important. Can our students ask for help when they need it? Even our nonverbal students who might not use their words to ask for help, there are other forms of communication for them to ask for help. Coping strategies, Metacognition. Does a student understand how they think and how the thinking process works? Other areas to consider. Health related, including mental health, technology use, especially in this virtual world, self-care, behavior, social emotional. There are many, many more. But these are some of the top issues that we see at CASE and areas of need to address. Next slide, please. So we have some questions in the chat, and as we move further along, we are definitely going to come back and address them. We're definitely leaving time for that, just to make sure. So why is it important to assess? Well, very often, we'll hear things like, my teacher says my kid has ADHD, or I think my student has this, it runs in the family. ADHD is the perfect example that we have here, because why assess? Because things like depression, oppositional defiant disorder, anxiety disorders, learning disabilities, Tourette syndrome, poor social history, lead poisoning, hearing loss, auditory processing disorder, language disorder, physical or sexual abuse, PTSD, executive dysfunction, head injury, traumatic brain injury, neurological disorder or an eating disorder. Guess what? All of these present like ADHD. They all have the same inattention and many other underlying, symptoms. But if we're just assuming that these things are ADHD and not getting to the root cause, we're doing our students a complete disservice, and we're not really helping address what needs to be addressed. So next slide, please. There you go. There's the answer. Next slide, please. Okay, it's really, really important to understand. Very often, like in the next slide, I think my student has ADHD. We will hear medical professionals say, this student has ADHD, they need an IEP at school. This student has a certain medical condition, they need an IEP at school. There very likely could be a correlation, but medical diagnosis is different than educational IEP eligibility. There are 13 categories for which a student can be found eligible for an IEP. Medical diagnoses, there's a bunch of them. They fill the whole ICD and DSM. So for educational eligibility, a student is identified under the IDEA after a school-based evaluation. An IEP team at school makes the determination of eligibility service. Schools identify disabilities based on the Ed Code, the federal law, not on the medical diagnosis codes. And most importantly, here's what we see in bolded here, is that conditions must also impact and affect the student's ability to function in the classroom or elsewhere in the school at the time they're identified. And then medical diagnosis is a medical condition or disorder. A doctor, a clinical psychologist, pediatric neuropsych, psychiatrist, or other clinical professional makes the diagnosis. Medical professionals diagnose and treat conditions that are found in the DSM. Conditions don't have to affect school performance. So that's where we very often see that a student has a diagnosis of, for example, we might see diabetes, asthma. I have asthma. I didn't have an IEP at school because my asthma didn't affect my ability to participate in my classroom and benefit from my education. It impacted me in PE, that's for sure. So I probably should have had a 504 plan. I had a medical form that was my parents filled out for me so that I was able to have an inhaler in school. But that didn't have educational impact to the way that some other, like specific learning disability like dyslexia. And when we talk about conditions like autism, for example, let's go to the next slide, please, because I'm getting ahead of myself. These are the 13 eligibility categories. So, for example, autism is the first category on the list. And so, if a child is found eligible under the category of autism, that is what the school psychologist will say after their assessment, is the child meets the eligibility criteria for autism as in their IEP. A school psychologist will never say, I diagnosed your student with autism. Two very different things. So other eligibility categories: deafblindness, deafness, emotional disturbance, hearing impairment, hard of hearing, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, that is a category, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, which is very often where we see kids with ADHD qualify, specific learning disability, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, we very often see those in there, speech and language impairment, traumatic brain injury, and visual impairment. Next slide, please. Now, when we talk about doing our assessments, the assessments that our school district do cover many areas, and they can be as individualized as the student. It's very important for us families when we're raising issues that we talk about our areas of concern and make sure they are addressed through the assessment. But almost all assessments will contain cognitive development information. These are the skills that help us understand how our students think. The main cognitive processing skills are crystallized knowledge, sometimes called verbal reasoning, fluid reasoning, sometimes called nonverbal problem solving, visual spatial processing, short-term memory, long-term retrieval, auditory or phonological processing, processing speed, and attention. You should definitely see scores for assessments for batteries of tests in all of these categories on your triennial assessments. All right, so then academic achievement, we always do cognitive. How does your student's brain work? If you are a student watching this yourself or a young adult, how does your brain work? What are your strengths? What are your areas that maybe brought us here in the first place? And we compare that to academic achievement. How does your brain work versus how are things working in the classroom? So we'll do assessments that measure your child's mastery of core academic skills: reading, writing, math, spelling, many other areas. So, and then we also, especially as our students are between the ages of 14 and 16, we start to see post-secondary and transition assessments that are related to your child's future needs for education, career planning, and independent living. Next slide, please. Additional things to consider. We mentioned earlier that an IEP is about more than academics. It's about the whole child and their whole experience at school. So make sure that those social emotional assessments are done as needed. Social emotional skills are the ability to identify and understand one's own feelings, to accurately read and comprehend emotional states in others, to manage strong emotions and their expression in a constructive manner, to regulate one's own behavior, to develop empathy for others, and to establish and maintain relationships. Important in the school and beyond. Adaptive skills that measures our students' ability to effectively and independently take complete functional living skills, to care for oneself, and to interact with other people. Also, very important life skills. Next slide, please. So, our students undergo these evaluations. We get these reports. Oftentimes they're 20, 30, 40 pages long. What on earth do these scores mean? So very often you'll see percentiles. You will see scaled scores. And or standard scores. The standard scores are what's represented on this bell curve. We're going to go back to statistics here for a minute. Welcome back to school, everyone. So first of all, get the word normal out of your vocabulary, everyone. There is no such thing as normal. When we talk about some of these assessments, these are all batteries of tests that have been normed. They've been done on students throughout the country, many cultural backgrounds, many socioeconomic statuses, many home languages, and all of their results, the tests have to be done in a very prescriptive way following a manual. And then all those scores are averaged out and they come up with a range. And so the standard scores that fall between 85 and 115, those are what we call average. When you see a score of 100, that's not perfect. Yay, you got an A plus 100 on a test like this. You are perfectly average, right in the middle. You are right in the average of what all the other students in the country are. Congratulations to you. So when we see scores between 115, or sometimes depending on the tests, it can be 90 to 110, or then those range is great. That's exactly what we want to see. That's the development, that's the functioning we want to see. Fantastic, great, wonderful. When we see scores below 85 or above 115, those are the ones where we might want to say, let's talk about this. This is either an exceptional strength that could be problematic in a traditional classroom, or it's an exceptional challenge that could be problematic in a traditional classroom, depending on both ends. And especially when you take all of these scores and you compare them. Very often our kids who have been assessed, we see some very, very high scores, some much lower scores, and looking at those independently and the areas that they are in and understanding those areas can really help give us a lot of great information about our students' struggles. If we understand what a score in what area means and what that looks like in a classroom, wow, that can be really powerful in helping us figure out how to support our students throughout a day. So when you sit in a meeting with your school psychologist and your team reviewing this data, these are great questions to ask. Wow, I see my student has a score of 75 in this area. How does that impact them in the classroom? What does that look like for them in a school environment? Help me understand. And that can lead to some really productive conversations. Next slide, please. I broke my own rule there and I didn't read anything off of the slide. Shame on me. I am sorry. Okay, so that was a 2-hour presentation about assessments in a really, really short time. So the Support for Families YouTube channel has the recordings of part 1, 2, and 3 of our presentation. Part 2 is all about assessments. If you want more information about assessments, there's a lot more details there. Check that out. But to finish this part out, the assessment is what leads us to eligibility. So after we've done all these assessments and we have this great information, we ask the following questions. Does this child meet the eligibility criteria for one of the 13 disabilities as defined by the IDEA? And there are very specific criteria laid out in the Ed Code for what it takes to meet the criteria and not. Very similar to the DSM and the ICD for medical diagnosis. Okay, so let's say a student does meet the criteria. Then we ask the next question. Does the child require specialized supports and instruction in order to gain educational benefit from the general education environment? If that question is yes, then welcome to the club. Your student qualifies for an IEP and we move on. So if there is any disagreement in any of this, if you think the data shows and your school team doesn't, if you have disagreement about how to look at the data and interpret it, we at CASE, we are not school psychologists. We have a huge amount of respect for our school psychologists, but I have to say we very often do sometimes step in and help ask questions. We look at reports to make sure that all the necessary parts of the report are there. For example, your report must contain recommendations. There's a lot of, an eligibility cannot be based on or denied based on only one single test in an area. They have to do multiple measures. So there's a lot of times where we'll look at reports and say, either we disagree, or we don't have enough information to decide, or some of the report components are missing. And then we might talk about the IEE, the Independent Educational Evaluation, as Karma mentioned earlier, which is one of our procedural safeguards, which is so important. That brings up the importance of understanding your procedural safeguards. But we don't just request IEEs because we don't understand the data. That doesn't help anyone. Making sure that we understand the data first is critical. So again, go back and review part 2. If you have any more questions, reach out to Support for Families. They've got a lot of great folks on staff. At CASE, we can help, do with our consultations and some of our services. So, all right, moving right along to the next slide, please. See, I got ahead of myself. Components of a strong report. So components of a strong report are all the federal and state mandated timelines met. You sign that assessment plan within 60 days. They have to have you in that IEP meeting. And we always at CASE recommend that you request your reports at least a couple days in advance so that you have time to review them. It's really, really hard to step into an IEP meeting with all of that technical information and process it while you're in the meeting and people are talking to you and then turn around and ask questions. It's too much. So ask for your reports ahead of time. Your report should include student history and family history. Parent, family, and outside provider interviews and reports and feedback should be included. Observations in multiple settings, classroom, playground, lunch, transitions. If you are requesting an assessment because there's a particular time of the day or area that's difficult for your child, we would hope that they're going to go do observations during that time of day, and maybe that can help tease out some of what's so difficult for your student. A variety of assessment tools in each area. I already covered that. Eligibility determination recommendations. There's an asterisk there because they can't finalize anything until you get into the IEP meeting and talk about it as a team. That would be predetermination. And then recommendations for accommodations and other classroom supports. When you are looking through your assessment, maybe have this slide there with you, kind of as a checklist. And if you're missing any of this, go back to your team and ask where it is. Next slide, please. All right, reviewing SMART goals. All right. Stephanie, Karma, I'm not sure which one of you I'm popcorning to right now. All right, tag Karma, you're it.
Stab at it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lee. All right, I have a little friend here with me, so he might have some input too. Let's review our session on goals. Next slide, please. Why are goals so important in the IEP? Let's remember the slide that Stephanie reviewed. The needs drive the goals. The goals drive the services. We write goals so that the student can be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum. And those goals have to be aligned to the Common Core standards. So think of the goals as the way that we go from where the student is right now to making sure that the student participates in the same concepts and is learning the same lessons as their non-disabled peers. Or maybe they're communicating the same way that their non-disabled peers are communicating if they have speech and language goals. Or maybe we're working on behavior so that they are learning the age-appropriate ways to behave in the classroom.
I can drop it on the top.
So goals address each area of educational need, regardless of the disability category.
Mommy, then again.
They meet the student's unique needs in an individualized manner, and they measure the student's growth and success in those areas of need. So we should be able to tell from the goals Did the student get to their expected destination? And did the IEP provide meaningful educational benefit? Because the goals must have benchmarks.
Up now.
Because the goals have benchmarks, we should be able to make sure that a student
Mommy.
Karma, you have a very strong
student is making
self-advocate
progress
there.
throughout the year. Yes, Lee, I have a very strong advocate sitting on my lap right now. Very
If
much
he
more
needs
like-
you to popcorn to either one of us, you just let us know.
Will do. Thank you so much. Well, let's go on to the next slide.
Yellow.
All right, we call them SMART goals for a reason.
Yellow.
We want them to be specific, measurable, attainable and achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Here is an example of a very strong goal and the formula to write a strong goal. By 1 year from the date of the IEP, the student will,
Oh yeah.
and then tell them what you want the student to be able to do. And what kind of setting? How is it going to be measured? With how much accuracy will the student be able to complete the new skill they've learned? And with what kinds of supports? Take a photo of this slide right now if you need to, and make sure that the goals in your IEP resemble this formula that we're sharing with you now. Next slide. So, if you have a student in elementary school,
Orange.
yellow and pink in the paper together, that looks fantastic, buddy.
No yellow.
Navigating the
Blue.
school.
No,
For
no.
elementary school
Mommy.
students.
No yellow. Pink.
Stephanie, you want to take over?
Orange.
Sure. So potential elementary school areas of need. Independence is a huge area of need for most elementary schoolers. Starting with navigating the school, going up and down stairs, navigating sensory challenges and hallways, cafeterias and playgrounds, organization skills, putting a backpack, jacket, lunchbox, water bottle in a cubby, getting papers to and from school. Another one is attention following, direction, staying on task. Another important one is class participation, answering questions, asking questions, working with peers, ability to self-monitor, knowing when to use the bathroom, knowing when to put on or take off a jacket, and self-advocacy, asking for help, asking for accommodations, asking for a break. Those are really important relationships with peers, like taking turns and sharing. Was there anything you wanted to add on this particular slide, Lee, or should I go to the next one?
Keep going. You're doing great.
Okay, next slide, please. Oh, sweet. So tying it together, middle school areas of need can become goals. Executive functioning is a huge area of need for most middle schoolers. School, class attendance, getting to class on time, getting materials from locker between classes. Middle school is a huge transition when your elementary is going from 5th to 6th. Navigating sensory and social challenges in hallways, organization skills, organizing a backpack, desk, locker, binder, using a planner, planning and time management, identifying steps within an assignment project, developing a work completion plan, breaking big projects down into manageable chunks, initiating work independently, transitioning between tasks, locations. Another area would be work completion, managing homework across multiple classes, turning in class assignments and homework on time. These are just a lot of details within these like specific aspects of these middle school area goals. Class participation, again, of staying on task, answering questions, asking questions, participating in group projects, ability to self-monitor, using a planner, editing, revising work, staying on top of assignments across multiple classes, teacher expectations, and again, I can't say this one enough, we all self-advocacy, asking for help, having our children asking for accommodations, and asking for a break. It's a very important one. Next slide, please. Cool. And setting students up for success. Students don't magically meet their goals on their own. How are we giving them the skills, the tools to meet the goals? With social skill training modeling, that is one way. And with accessing to pre-dawn models, scribbling notes, using visual schedules, with access to the wellness center, a preferred adult, and some things to consider are what is the level of prompting required to meet the goal, fade to independence as much as possible, what accommodations are needed to achieve the goal. Like, for example, are there like checklists, graphic organizers? Is there a social skills group where they can scaffold and learn from each other and more, like written into, making sure that this is written into the goal so the staff know. Was there anything else that you wanted to add, Lee? I felt like I'm missing something.
No, I just think when we talk about tying it all together, and we'll see some concrete examples of this later, we see this verbiage. If this is something a student is going to need to meet the goal, sometimes this will be the first part of the goal. That's why you see the comma, ... right? And then we will ask, okay, so wait a minute. If a student needs social skills training, or if they need someone to model something before they can actually do it, when we get to from the goals into the services, we want to think about, wait a minute, in goal number 3, remember when we said that this would be with social skills training? Where do we see that social skills training, or where do we see that social group in the services grid? Wait, if they need a model, if they need someone on the playground to model good practices, where do we see that person written in the services grid? Where do we see those para minutes, or any of that? Like, so that's how we set our, this is the needs drive goals, goals drive services. That's a part of it. So thank you for that, Stephanie.
Thank you for explaining that, Lee. Next slide, please. The new standard for goals, Andrew F. and appropriately ambitious. To meet its substantive obligation under the IDEA, a school must offer an IEP reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. Goals must be appropriately ambitious in light of a child's individual circumstance. Next slide, please. What does appropriately ambitious actually mean? From EdFacts about Andrew F., December 2017, if a child is not making expected progress towards his or her annual goals, the IEP team must revise, as appropriate, the IEP to address the lack of progress. From the Andrew F. decision, the IEP must be appropriately ambitious in light of his circumstances, just as advancement from grade to grade is appropriately ambitious for most children in their regular classroom. And from Ed's grade level standards guidance, November 2015, in a situation where a child is performing significantly below the level of the grade in which the child is enrolled, an IEP team should determine annual goals that are ambitious but achievable. The goal should be sufficiently ambitious to help close the gap. Next slide, please. I'll popcorn it to Lee.
Okay, just a couple things to point out here. Oh, we have a duplicate slide. Sorry, folks. But when we talk about appropriately ambitious, we can go to the next slide. Oh, here we go. More about goals. Sorry, that was where we needed to be. My apologies. When we talk about appropriately ambitious, that is a huge change from where we were 10 years ago. We used to have a standard of de minimis. Kids could just pass from grade to grade to grade, and well, what are we going to do? That appropriately ambitious standard, really was a game changer for us. And now what that means is when we're sitting in IEP meetings, we want to make sure, are these goals, is the work that we're expecting our children to do tied to the grade level standards? Do we know what's in the Common Core standard? And is that the standard that our children are being held to? Are they being given the same high expectations as everyone else in their class? Just because a student has dyslexia or autism or many other things, doesn't mean we should have lower standards for them. And that's what this is all about. And so that's where we as advocates, you as family members, you as students need to know that you have the same right to that grade level education as everyone else does. So that's a big part of this. And a couple other things about goals here. Having short-term objectives in our goals, those are great opportunities to benchmark progress more than once a year. It's nothing more frustrating than to get into an IEP meeting at the end of the year or, at your yearly IEP meeting just to see, oops, no progress has been made. Short-term objectives can give us benchmarks aligned with the report card periods so that we have checks throughout the school year. And progress monitoring is very important. Families should be receiving progress reports on their goals at every report card period. If you're not, start asking your team for them. And goals should be jargon-free. We see a lot of educational speak in our goals sometimes. But do our students, if I have a middle school student who has an IEP, can he read his goal? Can he understand his goal? He should be able to. Same thing with my high schooler. As a parent who's not a teacher, I should be able to read and understand what you're expecting of my kid. Very, very important. And also, when we write these goals this year, we ask ourselves and as our team, what will next year's teachers, therapists, and other professionals, when they're implementing this goal, will they know what we expect? We have to be very, very specific and careful in our language because next year it's going to be a whole different team of people looking at this goal. So anyway, next slide. And Karma, I will popcorn to you.
Thank you, Lee. Let's take it away. Offer of FAPE. Next slide, please. All right, here it is. We love to show you the slide because this is how the process works, and we all need a reminder. The needs drive the goals drive the services. Next slide. So, what do accommodations look like in an IEP? Whatever the student needs them. Disability is as unique as the person. So the accommodations are as unique as the disability and therefore are unique to the person. Next slide. So accommodations and modifications, what are they? What's the difference? Both of them are part of instruction and assessment, and both of them must be documented in the IEP. But accommodations just change how a scale or standard is taught, and it helps students demonstrate the learning or mastery of a skill. There are 5 categories. It has to do with timing, scheduling, presentation of the material, response, and setting. I would even say communication is another one. Modifications, on the other hand, changes what is being taught. The modifications change and lower the learning expectations. This is especially true for students with intellectual disabilities or other cognitive disabilities, where mastering grade level content may not be a possibility. Because it changes what is taught, it may not necessarily be meeting the core curriculum standards, may not necessarily be meeting grade level standards for promotion based on grades. And instead, we promote students grade to grade based on the IEP goals that they meet. Next slide, please. So, is it an accommodation or is it modifications? Here are the questions you ask. Has the student been asked to demonstrate the core common core content mastery, but just in a different way? Are we expecting the student to learn and understand the same content as their neurotypical peers?
Mommy.
Is the same reading
Mommy,
rubric and the same standard
hungry.
being used for all of the students?
Mommy, I'm hungry. I want ice cream.
Oh, ice cream, doesn't that sound good right now for everybody? Is what the student being taught aligned to the Common Core standards? Ice cream sandwich. Your sister makes.
Can I get some? Mom, come downstairs.
Okay.
I'm free in the bowl. I'm free.
Have your sister help you, buddy.
I miss those little voices. My kids are much, much older. So.
You can choose ice cream one.
Okay, bye.
You can choose
Is
ice cream.
what the student being taught aligned to Common Core standards? Right?
Popcorn delay. I'll take care of the ice cream.
Save some for me. Yes. I think we all need a little the little toddler eating ice cream in our life every once in a while, right? Especially this time of year. When we talk about accommodations and modifications, we see a lot of confusion amongst our teams. Very often, for students with ADHD, we might say, all right, instead of 100 homework problems coming home about addition and subtraction, maybe the student can do half of those. Or a student can do, if it's a bunch of exercises, maybe they can do the front page instead of the back, or something like that. And as long as the student can still demonstrate that they've memorized their multiplication, addition, subtraction, whatever they're working on, as long as a shortened assignment can show that they understand the facts, great, that's wonderful. But sometimes we'll see folks say, well, that modifies the curriculum, so we can't do that. Or, well, that takes them off grade level standard. And so understanding what is a modification, this is where we sometimes get into the weeds with our teams and help them parse out the difference between an accommodation and a modification. If you're still teaching grade level content, great, we're accommodating. We're providing accommodations. So we can dig into that more. If anyone needs any help, you can of course reach out to us and we'll provide more information. And like these slides will be available too. So next slide, please. All right. So the other thing we see when we're putting together the accommodations section of the IEP, so when we talk about the offer of FAPE, if you look at your actual IEP, the offer of FAPE is towards the back of the IEP, and that includes the accommodations, modifications, services grid. So when we talk about the accommodations section of the IEP, very often well-intentioned teams will just throw everything they can think of in the accommodations. Sometimes that's helpful, sometimes it's confusing. And particularly when our accommodations are overly vague, it is often not really helpful. So a check for understanding, we see that in IEPs all the time. That's great, but what is a check for understanding? You know, if a teacher turns to a student at the end of the language and says, you good? You get it? And the kid says, uh-huh. Have you really checked for their understanding? So what we like to do at CASE is maybe reframe that as after a lesson, ask a student to summarize the conversation. Or before you begin the assignment, ask the student to repeat the directions so you know they actually know what they're going off to do, right? That could save you a lot of time in the end. As a parent, I've learned that strategy the hard way. Preferential seating versus flexible seating. Who decides what is preferred? What space in the classroom actually facilitates student learning? We have a lot of kids with sensory dysregulation, attention dysregulation who, you might think should be front and center, but who might actually need to be laying on a pillow in the back of the room. We see kids who need to be laying and writing. We see kids who need the fidget stools, who need bands against their chairs so they can just be kicking. There's a lot of ways that our kids very often know, and they have learned over the years how to regulate themselves. And our well-intentioned teachers who say, sit down, stop fidgeting, you're distracting the rest of the class. Some teachers get it. More and more teachers are getting it, but we still have some teachers who in some environments don't necessarily recognize that in and of itself is a student's self-accommodation, their self-regulation skills. So something to consider when you're talking about what that means in your IEP. Extra time on assignments. How much time is appropriate? If we just give a student until the end of the semester to turn in all of their assignments, are we actually just creating more stress for them at the end of the year because everything is piled up? Or are we outlining how much time we're actually going to give them? Sometimes what a student really needs is organization skills or time management support or things like that. So making sure that we're defining what extra time on assignments means, and we're not just putting more onus on a student, that we might actually be wanting to provide some more adult support in there as well when we work on this. So the example here, how about help a student set up a timeline for completion of long assignments instead? One of the other ones we see very often is chunk large assignments into smaller sections. Helping the student learn how to do that too can be a great lifelong skill. Provide supports as needed. We see that in IEPs a lot. That's a head scratcher. The whole point of the accommodations section is to provide the supports as needed. So that doesn't seem to be one that's actually really helpful at all. So when we see that, we say, this is a great start. Let's define them. So a question to ask is, when you look at any of these, can you actually monitor whether or not it's being implemented? Like, some of our accommodations are so vaguely written that we're scratching our head about them. So the question we would ask is, this is a great idea, but how are we actually going to monitor if it's happening? And if the team can't identify it, then it's probably an overly vague accommodation, and we might want to narrow it down a little bit. We might want to be a little bit more specific. Next slide, please. All right, more about accommodations and modifications. So this is a very teachable moment. If you want an intro point to helping your child understand their IEP, and we recognize not every student is always going to have the capacity, not every student is going to get to the point where they're going to advocate for themselves. They might always need us as our parents to advocate for them and with them. But there are some students who absolutely the end goal is to launch them into college, whatever the case may be. And so making sure that they not only understand how their brain works, what accommodations they need to be successful, but how to ask for those. If you've got a student that's heading off to college, they totally need to know all of that. So this is a very teachable moment. Does your student understand their IEP? And specifically the accommodations and modifications? If the IEP seems like a daunting thing to explain to your student, well, guess what? The accommodations and modifications are a great place to start, because very often that is the part that the student has to request themselves. So that's a good intro. Does your student, if they know what their accommodations are, and let's say their accommodations aren't being implemented, do they have the self-advocacy strategies to ask for them? So if not, okay, that's all right. No problem. We can teach those self-advocacy strategies, or if there's a power dynamic that they can't address, do they have the support of adults like us who they can come to, who we can help them? Those are really, really key points and huge things that if we start working on this in elementary school, middle school, and high school, really help set our kids up for success long term. So again, progress reports and conferences are great opportunities to benchmark or to check in with teachers and other staff to ensure that accommodations and modifications are being implemented. You see a recurring theme here? We want to progress monitor. We want to continuously be checking. We want to know. We don't want to go from one annual IEP meeting to the next annual IEP meeting. We want a lot of information in between. Accommodations and modifications, like our goals, should be jargon free. Do you understand what's being, not measured by the goal, but do you understand what's being implemented by the accommodation? If not, like we just said in the last slide, it's okay to ask for clarification. And ask yourself and the team, just like with goals. When next year's teachers, therapists, and other professionals implement these accommodations and modifications, will they know what we expect? Critically important. Next slide, please. Okay. So where can we get more information? A lot of these are great resources. We mentioned the Special Education Rights and Responsibilities Manual. There's a lot of great information in there. Check that out. And the San Francisco Unified School District has a Section 504 resource guide from the year 2017. It used to be on their website. It's not anymore. But they have an entire 8-page section all about accommodations. That is a gold mine of things to think about. We can happily send that to anyone who wants it. Reach out to Support for Families. Leave us a note in the chat, whatever, and we will make sure that we get you a copy of that. So, all right. And there is a great comment in the chat right now. This all sounds really good, but there are many schools that don't implement the IEP as it is written in the contract, and families of color are usually the ones that suffer most with their academic and lack of support with SFUSD. And that is absolutely true, to the point where SFUSD has been sanctioned by the state of California as significantly disproportionate in the number of students that are referred to special education under the categories of emotional disturbance and OHI. And it's important to recognize that those are the categories we use when we have kids with externalizing behaviors. So we see the big behaviors of our students of color. We don't necessarily recognize their underlying academic needs that are leading to those behaviors. The state recognizes this too, and they've sanctioned us for it. We're also significantly disproportionate in the number of Black males, Black boys in particular, who we over-suspend. Huge issue in SFUSD, and there's a whole group that's doing a lot of work around this. It's called the CSACE team. That stands for Comprehensive Coordinated Early Intervening Services Team. SFUSD has a very strong community advisory committee for special education, and I know Support for Families is also doing a lot of work. They have a affinity space for our African American families. So if anyone is interested in more information about either of these, please reach out to Support for Families or reach out to CASE, and we would be happy to connect you with more resources. Huge issue and a big, big mandate to improve outcomes here. This is something we work on at CASE, and this is something that Support for Families does a lot of work around too. Okay, next slide. I just felt it was really necessary to uplift that. We have a huge equity gap in San Francisco Unified. Definitely worth naming. All right, so when we talk about the services grid, we talk about the accommodations, modifications, and then we talk about the services. That's all part of the offer of FAPE, right? And some schools use that interchangeably. Services grid, offer of FAPE. So what can services look like? Same. Whatever a student needs them to look like. Next slide, please. All right. Karma, can I popcorn to you? And did you save me some ice cream?
Absolutely. Ice cream dilemma solved. Okay, what can services look like in an IEP? So the special education law is actually very specific about this. The IEP must also include a clear description of all services the student will receive, including the level and location at which the instruction will be provided, and any additional services and modifications that the student will receive to enable the student to progress academically. For each service, the IEP must provide details on the frequency, duration, and location of the service, and any accommodations for statewide testing must be clearly described. That's why we dedicate 3 whole pages of the IEP to statewide testing, and why you're always going to see that listed on the IEP. It has to be there, even if the student is out of the testing range. It's also why the services grid and the IEP is set up the way it is. The school district has to tell you how all of the services in the IEP are going to be provided. It has to tell you how often your child is pulled for speech services. They have to tell you how many minutes of specialized academic instruction the student will receive, and whether it's a pull out, push in, whether it's individual or group, and where those services are going to be provided. Sometimes the service location might be a little bit vague. It just might be service provider location. Sometimes it will be at the school of residence. Sometimes it just depends on what service it is. If you have a student who receives educationally related mental health services, sometimes that student might meet their counselor off campus. But usually for speech and language services, occupational services, or specialized academic instruction, that's going to be at the school where they attend. Next slide. So how do we determine what services are needed? What evidence-based instruction, such as specialized academic instruction, or related services like speech, nursing, counseling, occupational therapy, and so forth, or para or aid support, are needed to support the student in receiving and reaching their goals? The services should be provided to support all goals, and this includes behavior goals. The IEP must be specific about where and when those services will be provided. As I said, push in, pull out, group, individual, and what minutes and what hours will address each area of the need and the goal. We also need to understand the difference between direct services and consultation. So on those 2 points, I want to help you, the parent, understand something. When you take a look at the goals that are in your child's IEP, look at how many academic goals there are and see how many minutes of specialized academic instruction. The more goals there are, the more minutes of specialized academic instruction there should be. If you have at least 1 speech goal, there should be at least 30 minutes of speech and language service to support that 1 speech goal. Sometimes you can have 30 minutes of service for 2 speech goals. It depends on what's appropriate for the student and what the student's needs are and how they can be met. If you have at least 1 occupational therapy goal, then you should have at least 30 minutes a week of occupational therapy. Again, the needs drive the goals drive the services. If you have goals in the IEP, there must be a service to support that goal. But sometimes students might receive or might work with a related services provider, but that related services provider doesn't have goals or services. That's when you have consultation. And the service provider provides consultation minutes across a month or a year in order to support other members of the IEP team. For example, an occupational therapist might support a classroom teacher in ensuring that a student with ADHD or sensory needs has access to all the sensory tools when and as necessary. That occupational therapist might help the classroom teacher understand when the tools should be available and when the student is more likely to need access to those tools, and how to recognize when the student might need access to sensory tools. This is just an example of consultation. A speech pathologist, the speech and language pathologist, might provide consultation to help a teacher understand when a student may not be able to communicate as clearly. Maybe this is a student that didn't quite meet eligibility for speech and language services, but could still use some guidance from an SLP in the classroom. When we can't identify a concrete goal for a student, but there might be some level of need, that's when we provide the consultation. Finally, is there time written into the IEP for your service providers to collaborate and communicate with each other, with you as the parent, and with any independent professionals? That's also consultation. And you can request that consultation minutes be in there specifically to ensure that all staff are communicating to meet your child's needs. Next slide.
Before we go on to the next slide, one of the things that I wanted to point out is we mentioned related services here. I dropped a list of the related services into the chat because I think it's very important for families to understand that there are a lot of services that teams can write into IEPs with very specific definitions behind them in the ed code. So if you've got goals in areas where you're not sure exactly what would be the service, here are some of the related services: audiology, counseling services, interpreting services, medical services, occupational therapy, orientation and mobility services, parent counseling and training, physical therapy, psychological services, recreation. We don't see that one written into IEPs very often. Rehabilitation counseling services. We should use more of that for our older students who are transitioning out of schools and into adulthood. School health and school nurse services. Someone asked a question in the chat about that earlier. Social work services. Sometimes we hear folks say, oh, but our school sites say, well, social workers are gen ed. That's tier 1. We don't write it into IEPs. Really? It's in the ed code that we can. Speech language pathology and transportation. Just wanted to point that out before we move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. And one other thing that I want to say, some of these services actually have criteria that need to be met in order for those services to be provided to the student. For example, with speech pathology services, the student must either have an articulation disorder or they have to meet the 7th percentile or lower on at least 2 subtests within the speech and language assessments. So it can be a fairly high bar to meet, which is one reason why for students who have speech and language disorders or communication needs, you see a lot of consultation minutes being put into the IEP. Let's go on to the next slide. All right, determining appropriate academic services.
Karma, we have a question in the chat that's worth answering live. So the question in the chat is, I have an IEP for my daughter. She needs to have 300 minutes per week in different areas: reading, writing, and math. It should be provided by someone specialized or from a volunteer parent in the classroom. So my response in the chat was, specialized academic instruction must be provided by a credentialed special educator, or someone on an emergency credential. We have a lot of teachers on emergency credential, but in order for it to qualify as the services, and not a paraeducator either. Paraeducators are wonderful. They are the backbone of our education system, but they don't have the appropriate training to implement specialized academic instruction. This is not something that a parent volunteer or even a gen ed teacher should be doing. If it's written into the IEP, it must be done by a special education teacher if it's under the specialized academic instruction area.
And it's important to understand that the IDEA, the Federal Special Education Law, requires that all of these people be highly and specially trained in the area they are teaching. So any student who is receiving specialized academic instruction in their IEP must be trained, must be educated by a trained special education teacher, not by a general education teacher, not by a volunteer, by someone who is credentialed to teach special education to students with disabilities. Okay, so what are the best practices for my students' disability or area of need? What current research is available that can provide us guidance on that? What do the professional organizations offer as best practices? And is there technical guidance, a practice implementation manual, or other information that informs services? Now, when we see specialized academic instruction written into the IEP, it is perfectly legitimate. And in fact, I highly encourage every parent to ask, what kind of program are you using to teach my child? How many minutes a day are you using that program? And why is that the appropriate program to teach my child? For example, you can see on the screen here the California Dyslexia Guidelines. For students who have dyslexia, this is the guideline, the book, that tells school districts what the best practices are for educating students who have dyslexia and other learning disabilities. So if we use dyslexia and we go through these questions, right now, the answers to these questions would be, what are the best practices for my student's disability and area of need? For a student with dyslexia, reading is best taught by structured literacy. What current research is available that can provide us that guidance? Peer-reviewed research that has been documented and proven to assist students who have dyslexia to make progress and significant progress on reading and learn to read at grade level content standards. What do the professional organizations offer as best practices? When you consider what some of the teacher organizations or even COPA, the Professional Special Education Advocate Organization, recommend, you can find some specific programs listed that should be used to teach students with dyslexia, such as structured literacy using Orton-Gillingham, or structured literacy with Wilson, or structured literacy such as Lindemood-Bowell. And then is there technical guidance, a practice and implementation manual, or other information that informs services? With all of the programs that I just listed, such as Orton-Gillingham, Lindemood-Bowell, Wilson, and SFUSD's favorite program, which is called SPIRE, yes, there is an implementation manual that tells teachers exactly how they should be providing these resources and learning programs to students every day. Next slide, please. Ooh, I think we need to go back just a little bit. There we go, thank you. Behavioral considerations and services. Under behavior, a multi-tiered system of support can be used as a system of interventions that are offered to the student. Then there's universal design for learning. Is the student's environment set up for them to be successful? And when we talk about universal design, we're talking about a setup that works for everyone in the classroom. In fact, one of the universal designs for learning that we're using tonight is by us reading the slides to you. That means that people using interpretation services understand what the content of the slides are. And if there are anyone with visual processing disorders or who are blind or low vision, the slides are then accessible to them by being read. What do positive behavior interventions look like in the student's classroom? And there's some acronyms here that are frequently used for behavior. ABA, which is Applied Behavioral Analysis, BCBA, which is a board-certified behavioral analyst, and RBT, a registered behavior technician, or a very specialized and highly trained para that will oftentimes be hired to implement a student's behavioral intervention plan. Guiding questions to ask: what need is the behavior addressing? For example, we often think of behavior as communication. And when the BCBA is assessing the student, they will use the ABCs of behavior. What is the antecedent of the behavior? What is the trigger? What is the cause? Then what is the behavior itself? What kinds of externalizing behaviors? Is it eloping and running away? Is it physical aggression? Is it language? Or is it something else, property destruction? And then the consequence. What is the consequence of the student's behavior? And what is the student trying to obtain as a result of that behavior? Also, what skill has the student not yet fully mastered that needs to be taken into consideration? And finally, transition. That is an entirely different workshop. Transition, that focuses on the student's transition to post-secondary life, whether it's college and university, whether it's a vocational school, whether it's SFUSD's Access program, or something else entirely. All sorts of options are valid and on the table, depending on the student's unique needs. And Lee just dropped a really helpful thing in the chat. ABA is sometimes controversial. There's an old form of ABA that is absolutely horrific and is often called torture by many people with autism or other developmental disabilities. ABA has changed. There's a more ethical form of it out now that's being used in schools, and it really follows the behaviorist communication, trying to understand the behavior and why it happens. There's also a different approach by Dr. Ross Green, and Lee dropped that link in the chat for you to look at. Let's go to the next slide.
One thing we want everyone to understand, that when we're talking about anything dealing with changing a student's behavior, that the student needs to be honored and centered in the process, that we're not looking at just changing behaviors because they're inconvenient for a school team. And as Karma mentioned, behavior is a form of communication, and behavior is very often the ways that our students have figured out their own accommodations. What benefit is that giving them? And honoring that at the center of everything we do. There's nothing wrong with a child being autistic and having behaviors like stims if that's how they if that's how they self-regulate. That's just fine. Any program that tries to unautism a kid or treat their behaviors as less than is something we need to definitely question.
Thank you, Lee. Absolutely.
I think we can skip this slide. This I think this slide isn't prime time ready.
Again, needs drive goals, goals drive services. We can't repeat this enough. This really is the process that we follow when we're trying to put the entire IEP together. Next slide. Okay, at the very start of our presentation tonight, I mentioned the least restrictive environment. It's a spectrum. The least restrictive environment isn't a particular physical place. The least restrictive environment is basically the totality of the student's education and where everything that the student needs can be provided, and the setting that is most appropriate for them and that is not overly restrictive, that gives them access to their general education peers. Or sometimes the least restrictive environment for students might actually be a special day school, like a non-public school, And for some of our students, the least restrictive environment might actually be a residential treatment center. But what the law says is that each public agency must ensure that to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities, including children in public or private institutions or other care facilities, are educated with children who are not disabled. And special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from their regular educational environment occurs only if the nature or the severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. One of the things that we often hear parents tell us at CASE is that they cannot have an aide supporting their student in the general education classroom because that's too restrictive. But as you can see from what I just read on this slide, having the aide is actually an appropriate supplementary service and support that helps the student be able to access the general education classroom. It's not restrictive, it's actually appropriate. The IDEA actually says that we must provide a free, appropriate public education to students in the least restrictive environment. So when your IEP team starts talking about, oh, I don't know, we need to be in a less restrictive environment, I don't know if that's actually going to be okay, we have to focus on the least restrictive environment. A parent's response is, but we need to focus first on what is appropriate for my student, and for my child. What is appropriate comes before the least restrictive environment. And to the greatest extent possible, we hope that what is appropriate is in the general education classroom, unless we know that the student cannot access the education there, even with the aids and services necessary to do so. Next slide. Leah, I'm going to popcorn back to you.
Perfect. So this slide is, thank you for all that, Karma. That was so important and so helpful. It's really important to understand the least restrictive environment. As Karma said, sometimes the least restrictive environment for a student isn't gen ed. Sometimes it is. But when you've got a student with dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, attention issues, and they have so many, like if you've got a kid with dyslexia, we'll get into the best practices, but that could be an hour of specialized academic instruction in small group. If they have dysgraphia, wow, they're going to need a lot of pull-out for handwriting support. If they have dyscalculia, wow, they're going to need a lot of pull-out for math support. When you get to the point where you're adding up all these minutes and you're saying, wow, wait a minute, my kid needs specialized support for 4 hours every day, and their school day is only 6 hours. And in those 6 hours, part of that is lunch and recess. So, wow, they're only spending an hour in the gen ed environment, and all the rest is pull out. Is that really the least restrictive environment? Do we want to think this through? So, anyway, this checklist that's here was actually developed. It's used within SFUSD. It was presented last year to the Community Advisory Committee for Special Education by special education staff. So it'll be in the slides that everyone has available. It's a great resource. We have 15 minutes left, so I think we should probably move to the next slide. Sorry to not read that, but it's a very, very small. I don't know that my old lady eyes could read it anyway. And here are just some great questions to ask about, least restrictive environment and your environment. So clarifying questions, conversation starters if there's some tension in the team about where your students should be. Here's ways that we might phrase it at CASE. Before we move the student out of his general education environment, or general education classroom and into a more restrictive environment because of his behaviors, why can't we try the use of supplementary aids, such as a registered behavior technician, to support the student in the classroom? That seems like a reasonable ask to me. That keeps him in the LRE, right? My student is being pulled out of their general education class for so much intervention that they're missing most of the day with their peers. Is this still the least restrictive environment? See, I always get ahead of myself. Should we consider a placement with the interventions built into the classroom? My child is in the mod to severe special day class, and they are very social and enjoys time with non-disabled peers. Could we find another elective class for her to attend so she has more time in the general education setting? And if that's something we want to see, maybe we might want to have a socialization goal written into the IEP so that we could focus on that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, predetermination. Very, very, very important to understand. I mentioned before when we were talking about those assessment reports that when school teams present them to you, they need to present you with a draft. The same thing when they send an IEP to you, it must be a draft. The IDEA calls out predetermination as a procedural violation. Procedural violations are bad. So I'm going to read the quote here. In matters alleging a procedural violation, a hearing officer may find that a child did not receive a free, appropriate public education if the procedural inadequacies significantly impeded the parent's opportunity to participate in the decision-making process regarding the provision of a free, appropriate public education to the parent's child. If you are being impeded from being part of the decision-making process, that's a procedural violation. So how do schools impede us as parents in participating in the process? Sometimes it's unintentional. Sometimes it is very much intentional. When we hear things in the school from principals, for example, in our IEP meeting, when we're asking for social skills, and the principal says things like, well, we don't offer that here. We don't have the staff for that. We don't have the training to implement that program. Or if sometimes you hear, someone will say, well, we all met, all of our school staff and our central office folks, we met before the meeting and we decided that this is what's appropriate. When you hear those kind of things and they're not taking your feedback into consideration, they're not allowing you to participate in the decision, that's predetermination. We flip that on its head, when a principal says things like, well, we don't have the staff here. We'll say, okay, we respect that, especially now. Everyone is working hard. Oh my gosh. I have so much respect for anyone who still is working in special education. You might not have those resources at the school. Can the central office help us bring in someone like an itinerant social skills teacher? Can we contract with an outside agency to bring that in? Can you give us compensatory education minutes so we go to someone who's a Michelle Garcia winner, social thinking practitioner, and we do that outside of the school? If we think that this is something that's going to give my child educational benefit, then you've got to find some way to provide it. Let's get creative, folks. Let's not resort to predetermination. Next slide, please. All right, so we've gotten through the IEP process, we've done the assessments, we've written great goals, we've got great accommodations, modifications, services, wonderful. Now we're to the point of signing the IEP. That's where we get into informed consent. So informed consent is you've been fully informed in your home language. You've received a copy of the IEP in your home language, not been forced to sign the English version that they put in front of you in the IEP meeting. Or in your preferred communication method, and you know what the school is proposing or what they're denying. You understand and agree in writing, and you understand that your consent is voluntary and you can withdraw or deny consent at any time. And some notes about consent. You have the right to ask the school to explain anything and everything. Changes to a student's IEP don't go into effect until you sign and consent to the IEP. So if you walk out of an IEP meeting and you're like, yay, I'm getting an hour more services for my kid, this is great, but you haven't signed for consent, they're not going to start those services until you sign. And we are lucky here in California that we can sign with exceptions. So for example, if you want to sign an IEP to start services, but you still might have some wordsmithing to do on the goals, or you're not sure about some other parts of the IEP, you can sign with exceptions and clearly state, look, this is just to get the new services started. We still have more work to do. You can totally do that. Absolutely an option. Next slide, please. Okay, and it's very important. Once we get through, you agree with everything on the IEP, we're moving forward. Wonderful. Progress monitoring is critical. We talked about short-term objectives. We talked about progress reports. We talked about report cards, student conferences. All of these are really, it's important that you stay in communication with your school team year-round. There is a burden on us as parents to be part of the communication. If you're not hearing anything from your team, oh my goodness, anyone working in public education this year in particular, they're so overworked. It's not that they're trying to ignore you. It's just they've got a lot of kids on their caseload. So reach out, ask the questions. Progress monitoring is a year-round process. You should be getting those progress reports at every report card period. And like I said, if you're not getting them, reach out and ask. That's okay. If you're not seeing the progress you would expect, call an IEP meeting, discuss it. Talk to them about the goals, the services. Or if you're sitting here scratching your head saying, wait a minute, my IEP needs work, call an IEP meeting. Have one in January. Have one in early February. Do it. Take this information you've learned here today and go forth and conquer. All right. Next slide, please. Okay. Now we're going to tie it together with some advocacy strategies. So next slide, please. We have some very concrete examples. You know, we keep throwing up this flow chart. Needs drive goals, goals drive services. What exactly does that look like, right? So let's take the example of a student with autism. And I want to be very careful here to name the fact that if you've met one student with autism, you've met one student with autism. These, what we're talking about here, are very stereotypical, and there are non-stereotypical presentations of autism too, especially in our girls. Our girls with autism very often present differently than the stereotypical ways that are very often linked to what we see in boys, right? So anyway, everything we're talking about here is stereotypical, and it can stereotypically, and it can apply to other members of other communities too. Some of these things might be true of kids with ADHD, intellectual disability. So it's not just in the autism community that we see these stereotypical concerns. But what we very often as a parent might present to the team is, or what the team might present to us is, wow, your student only wants to speak about preferred topics. They struggle with turn taking. They struggle with taking other people's perspective. They have a hard time transitioning from one thing to another, especially when they have to transition from a non-preferred or from a preferred recess, playing with whatever they want. And then we make them come do something they don't want to do. Ooh, those transitions are tough. They're easily distracted, easily dysregulated. They do a lot of stimming in the classroom. We see these as areas of need. Okay, so let's write goals to address them. SMART goals, using the formula before. We might write goals around engaging with non-preferred topics. We might write goals around waiting their turn. We might write goals around recognizing emotional or visual cues in our peers, transitioning with the class, staying on task, coping and self-advocacy skills. So we might write those in as goals. Okay, then once we have those goals in the IEP, what does that mean? What does that look like for services? Well, we're very likely going to need a social skills group or curriculum. Sometimes that's done by the school speech and language pathologist. Sometimes it's done by the school social worker. Sometimes it's done by someone outside. A student might need counseling sessions, maybe with the school psychologist again, or with the social worker that help them with the regulation strategies, some of the regulation. There's a lot of when the ZOR here, coping strategies such as ZOR, that's zones of regulation. We see that used by a lot of school psychologists and occupational therapists and teachers as well. So that's just one example of what some of this might, and of course there's academic goals as well. So moving to the next slide, we'll do this again, but with the example of a student with dyslexia. Karma talked about the California Dyslexia Guidelines, right? So, stereotypical ways that our students with dyslexia present in the classroom, they're reading 2 to 3 grade levels behind. They struggle with reading out loud. They avoid it at all costs. Their spelling is awful. They don't want to participate in anything related to literacy. Their spark and joy for reading is just gone. The only thing they want to read is graphic novels. So these are some of the issues we see. All right. So then when we talk about putting together an IEP for a student with dyslexia, we want to see goals in phonological and phonemic awareness. We want to see goals in decoding. That's being able to take those parts of words and break them apart. C makes the k sound, A makes the a sound, T makes the t sound, recognizing that's phonemic awareness. Reading comprehension. So not only do we want to see that kids can break the words down, sound them out, but we want to see that they get to the point where they can put them back together and read a sentence and not spend so much time breaking each word apart that by the time they get to the end of the line, they don't remember what they read. We want to see that they can actually comprehend it, right? And we want to see them get to the point of reading fluently. And of course, very often, like was mentioned before, we need goals around spelling. All right, so then that's a lot of goals. What do we do? When we talk about services, what is outlined in the California Dyslexia Guidelines and many of the programs that our schools use, structured literacy programs, Spire and Wilson both. When you want to implement their programs, and that's generally what SFUSD uses, is both of them say, all right, if I'm implementing Spire or Wilson with Fidelity, it should be 45, 60 minutes a day, each day, in small group, 2 to 3 kids, everyone at the same level, and working together. So if you've got a kid who's got reading struggles, and it's identified as dyslexia, and structured literacy is the program, and your IEP, you get to the services grid and they offer you 60 minutes of SAI, you've got to say, whoa, 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 whoa. That's not how these programs are supposed to be implemented with Fidelity. Let's talk about the number of minutes. It should be 300 minutes a week just for the dyslexia, let alone anything else we've got to talk about. That's how this flow chart works. And then from there, we talk about the placement, right? So if I've got 300 minutes a week, is that going to be pull out? Who's going to do it? Is that going to be in the small group with the RSP? So then we start talking about where that happens. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so now more specifically around advocacy strategies, one of our first advocacy strategies is always proactive communication. Proactively communicate with your team. And this is a great example of that. Pacer has a student snapshot. We love Pacer. You can find, we'll drop this example into the chat. We suggest that all families, before the school year starts, when you know who your teacher is, your case manager, all of the folks who are going to be interacting with your student, we suggest you send an updated version of this. Just one page, tells them a little bit about your student, their likes, their dislikes, their struggles, their motivators. We're over time, so I'm going to really speed through some of this. Next slide, please, because we want some, I think we've answered most of our Q&A in the chat. But Karma or Stephanie, do either one of you want to jump in here and take a few slides so people don't get sick and tired of listening to me for all of this?
Stephanie, do you want to give it a go?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Advocacy best practices. That's the next one. Okay, yes. Oh my gosh, my computer. Document if you didn't put it in writing, it didn't happen. This is something that I feel like I've had to definitely learn over time, that that you need to put it in writing. Otherwise, it didn't happen, just as this says. Over communicate with all members of the team. Request all student records in 5 business days, including incident reports. Request IEP meetings in writing as soon as concerns arise. Email the school that parent guardian will audio record the IEP meeting with at least 24-hour notice. I use voice memo on smartphones. There's like some apps I think Transcribe would be a really good one. Keep a copy of all IEPs, assessment forms, etc., in labeled folder or binder, in reverse chronological order and by school year. Ask your advocate for help putting together your IEP binder if necessary. Next slide. It's okay to ask questions and follow up as needed. Ask for clarification about anything and everything. Like, for example, walk me through the entire school day. When are counseling sessions? Is the para trained? These are some really good questions. Ask, can we try? Appropriate and reasonable should be your 2 new favorite words. What is reasonable? Is this appropriate for my child? Remember, everything in the IEP must be individualized. Identify your priorities and think about areas for potential compromise. Can we fit all of what we want into a school day? Like, is this realistic? You know your child better than anyone else. Share the strategies that work with your school team. Next slide, please. Advocacy best practices continued. Understand the people and the process. Get a copy of the contact list and org chart for the district you are working with and follow the chain of command. Are there additional resources in the district you can access, such as ADR, collaborative conferences, or facilitated IEP meetings? Assume best intentions. I know this one's a difficult one, especially for me. I feel like I'm still drilling this in my head, but it's really important to assume best intentions from the team. Learning the policies and ed code, both what's included and common misconceptions, like what isn't. Remember the ADA Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and all other federal laws, subset state and local code and policies. Next slide, please. Can I popcorn it to Karma?
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Karma.
So here are some great questions. Take a photo of the slide if you need to. Definitely review it afterwards. This is a great script for you to use as you make your way through your next IEP meeting. Please help me understand. When you start your questions with, please help me understand, you force the school district to explain their position and why they have made the decisions they've made in the offer of FAPE. Please help me understand, why are you proposing that service, that accommodation, or that goal? Have we considered something else, some other service as an area of need? Why or why not? How does this particular service help my child meet their goals? How does this address the need we identified in our present levels discussion? Can you please show me a copy of that policy, procedure, or guideline that you just told me? Can you tell me how this part of the IEP will be implemented? And what are we doing to address the concern that I, or the teacher, or the therapist raised earlier in the meeting? And one of the best questions to ask, please send that to me in writing after this meeting is over. Of course, if the meeting is being recorded, then your questions and the school district's responses to those questions have been recorded. Next slide. Informed consent. This is so incredibly important. Informed consent. It doesn't mean that they just told you. It means that you, as the parent, actually understand everything about the IEP and everything that was told to you by the school district, and that you understand fully how this is going to work. Families do not have to agree to the IEP at the meeting. The families can take the IEP home and review it and wait until the district translates all documents into their language. Families can sign the IEP with exception. And stay put is an option, albeit a last resort. If we absolutely cannot make any headway, then the IEP will go to stay put if the parents do not consent, or if the parents do not consent to removal from a service. Take advantage of any programs that are available for dispute resolution if you don't feel that things are making headway through the IEP team. And most importantly, remember that school personnel cannot retaliate against families for their disagreement. Retaliation is explicitly prohibited by both federal and state special education laws. Next slide. And the special education handbook. If you have a student in SFUSD, I highly, highly recommend that you look this at the bottom of this page, www.sfusd.edu/sped/handbook. And there it is in the chat. Next slide. Again, please reach out to CASE and please reach out to Support for Families if you have questions. Knowledge is power, and knowledge and empowerment get parents so much further in an IEP meeting. You can ask questions, you can use your rights, and you can find out how you can also be an equal team player to get your child what they need at school. Next slide.
One thing I
Any
wanted
other
to
questions?
follow up on, Karma, you had mentioned that families can record their IEP meeting. We don't have that clearly mentioned in here, but in order, California is a two-party state. It is illegal to record a conversation without letting the parties that you are recording know. You have the right in California to record your IEP meeting, but you need to inform the team in writing 24 hours in advance. And we absolutely think that everyone should record their IEP meetings. There's a lot that happens, and having that recording to go back and listen to later can really, really help a lot. But make sure you request it in writing at least 24 hours in advance.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording. That's okay.